Hello and welcome back to part 3 of this Oathmark Beginner's Guide. My name is Chris. Today we're going to have a look at expanding the basic rules, covering terrain and unit movement, and looking at advanced rules such as characters and monsters. So, starting with terrain, whereas most of your table will probably be fairly open, rough ground is a catch-all term for any terrain that is difficult to cross but not a major obstacle. This might include rocky or rubble-strewn ground, hills or mud, crop fields, or shallow water for example. When a unit moves across rough ground, you count the distance covered as double the amount moved to determine your total movement. For example, a unit of skeleton soldiers uses a single move action and enters rocky ground. They have a 6-inch movement and move 2 inches into contact with the rough ground, leaving them with 4 inches remaining. Further movement into the rocky ground counts as double the amount moved, so the remaining 4 inches of movement will allow them to physically cross 2 inches. In addition, a unit that makes a maneuver that begins or ends in rough ground immediately ends its activation when that maneuver is completed, regardless of whether it has actions remaining. Note that this does allow you to maneuver through rough ground without penalty, as long as you do not start or end the maneuver in that area. That seems weird at first glance, but contrary to the way they appear, units in Oathmark are not treated as rigid masses marching in formation as if on a parade ground. They are made up of individual men or orcs or elves that when formed up to fight, occupy a certain area. But when they are moving, they move as a group of individuals, and thus the unit as a whole can expand or retract or deform to adjust to the environment around them, before reforming at the end of their activation. Obstacles are features of terrain that a unit cannot simply march over or through, but must either climb or go around. Features such as walls or cliffs or deep water, for example. These come in 2 varieties, impassable or climbable. Impassable obstacles tend to be things like buildings or deep rivers or ravines, the kind of thing that cannot be crossed without great effort, or simply far easier to go around. A unit cannot move directly over an impassable obstacle, except in circumstances I'll reveal shortly. Climbable obstacles are generally smaller, and with a little effort a model could clamber up and over it. This might be a wall or a fence, or it might be a shallow ravine or small cliff face. A unit can move over these obstacles, but it must pay a movement tax. Measure the height of the obstacle, double it, and a unit can cross by expending that amount of its movement allowance. Remembering that a unit isn't a solid block, a unit may move through an obstacle as if it were not there if there is open ground on either side, the officer of the unit has a clear path, and the unit does not end its activation with any model on top of the terrain. The unit is assumed to deform to squeeze through or move around the obstacle, reforming on the other side. Additionally, if an obstacle has passable areas such as a bridge over a river or ravine, or a passage or defile through cliffs or walls, a unit may pass through with no penalty to its movement, so long as it has enough movement to reach the other side. Finally, if an obstacle is less than 3 inches long or 1 inch high, it's small enough that a unit can just flow around or over it. It can be moved through without penalty, so long as the unit does not end its turn on top of the obstacle. So if you've got a tree or an obelisk, the unit can make its way around it without having to avoid it entirely. Woods and ruins. Woods are a particular type of terrain with a couple more specialised rules. They cover a specific area. Typically you would use something like a base with a couple of movable trees on top, with the base defining that area. A unit cannot draw line of sight through woods, including those with the indirect fire special rule. They count as rough ground, and so limit movement and manoeuvres as previously mentioned. An artillery or mounted unit that enters the woods must make an immediate morale test. This ensures the unit can maintain order as riders get tangled in low branches, horses trip on roots and hollows, and artillery crews manhandle their bulky machines through the mess. A unit is considered to be in the woods if any part of the unit is touching the terrain. When a unit is in the woods no longer block line of sight to or from that unit. Also, a unit that is in the woods gains light cover when being the target of a shooting attack. If an artillery or mounted unit moves into combat with a unit in the woods, it must first make a morale test before fighting that round of combat. Ruins follow pretty much all of the same rules, the one exception being that units with the indirect fire rule may shoot over ruins. There will be times when some of your units are in close proximity and are required to move and maneuver around other units. Thankfully, this is very simple. A unit can move through friendly units as if they were not there, as long as they do not end their activation on top of another unit, and they don't move into contact with an enemy unit. A unit can maneuver through friendly units so long as they are separated at the end of the activation. However, you cannot move or maneuver through enemy units. Nice and easy. So let's talk about more advanced rules. First up, a unit of 1. This is a single model on the tabletop. It might be a character, a monster, or just a single soldier, whether due to casualties or you had a handful of points left over. A unit of 1 that has not yet activated this turn may pivot at any time, including during another unit's activation. This is an entirely free action and does not count as the unit's 1 maneuver this turn. However, once they have activated this turn, they will lose that ability. This allows a single model to react to threats around it much faster than it could as a group of models. Additionally, units of 1 must make a morale test every time they lose a point of health, though there are never any modifiers applied to their morale tests. Finally, we are onto characters, which I have been teasing for a little while now. Characters come in 3 main roles, though an individual character may fit into 2 or even all 3 of them. Those roles are Commanders, Champions, and Spellcasters. A Commander helps you to control your army and boost their morale. A Champion is a mighty combatant capable of devastating the enemy. A Spellcaster weaves magics to enhance your own troops or hinder your foes. Whatever role they fill, there are some common rules that they follow. Generally, with perhaps the primary exception being Spellcasters, they will be placed in a unit, where they will take over the role and position of the unit's officer. They count towards the maximum number of models in a unit, so for infantry with a maximum of 20 models, you could have 1 champion and 19 soldiers. You can only have 1 character in a unit. A character may only join a unit with the same base size, so infantry on foot and cavalry if mounted. A character that starts a game in a unit must remain in that unit for the rest of the game, just as a character deployed as a unit of 1 must also remain so for the game's duration. As part of a unit, a character gains any special abilities that that unit possesses, though the reverse is not true. If a character has special abilities, the unit does not gain them. And finally, a unit containing a character uses the lowest move stat of a figure in that unit. So a unit of human soldiers with move 6, joined by a dwarf captain, will be forced to use the dwarf captain's move of 5. When in combat, the character has a choice of whether to fight as part of the unit or to fight alone. If fighting as part of a unit, combat dice are determined as usual and use the fight and defense of the unit, ignoring those of the character. If fighting alone, you use the character's stats, combat dice, fight and defense, and ignore the units. When fighting alone, the character never gains any benefit from additional ranks. Characters are always the last casualty in a unit, and so even when fighting alone, all damage is applied to other figures in the unit first. The one exception being the champion die, which I will cover shortly. Any character with the special ability Command is a Commander, and they come with a couple of cool abilities. First of all, any unit that makes an activation roll or morale test while within 6 inches of a unit that contains a commander may roll 1 additional dice for that test. This includes the unit that contains the commander itself. 3 is the maximum number of dice you can roll for an activation or morale test, no matter if there are multiple commanders or other special rules in play. Additionally, when you successfully activate a unit that contains a commander, you can immediately attempt to activate another unit within 6 inches at the same time, or 2 additional units if the commander has the Command 2 ability. Once you have made those activation rolls, you complete each of those units' activations in whichever order you choose. If the roll is failed, the failing unit may only carry out a simple action as normal. You can only use this ability with the first unit that activates, not any of the additional ones, even if they also contain a commander. Basically, you can't daisy chain a bunch of commanders together. The best you can do is 3 units at the same time. The final thing to keep in mind with commanders is that if you put a character with command into a unit of figures with a lower, i.e. better, activation stat, the whole unit will use the character's higher or worse activation stat. So a unit of elves with activation 3 will have to use a goblin's activation of 6 if a goblin captain joins them. Champions are mighty warriors, capable of cutting through enemy ranks and putting down enemy characters. They may only join a unit of the same race, so elf with elf and dwarf with dwarf. When a champion is in combat, either fighting as part of a unit, fighting alone, or as a unit of 1, you replace one of the combat dice involved with the champion die. To make sure things are clear, it's a good idea to use a different coloured dice for your champion die, making sure it's obvious. This die cannot be removed using the shielding rule. When the champion is in combat, work out your total number of combat dice and target number in the usual way, making sure to swap out one dice with the champion die. Then, when you roll them, if the result on the champion die is equal to or greater than the target number, it causes one additional hit. Additionally, if you roll a 10 on the champion die, you've got a choice to make. You can apply the hits generated to the unit as normal, or you can choose to target the enemy officer or character if the officer has been replaced, assigning all hits generated by the champion die to that model. If the number of hits equals or exceeds the officer or character's health stat, the model is removed as a casualty. If the model has health remaining, use a die or tokens to track those remaining health points. Any excess hits from the champion die are lost, and hits scored by other dice are applied to the unit as normal. The benefits of killing an enemy character are fairly clear, but why kill a poor lowly officer? Well, if the officer or the character replacing the officer in a unit is killed, the unit only rolls 1 die for activation and morale tests. Having a commander nearby will allow them to increase this to 2. The hole in the front of the unit should be filled with a model from the back rank, who becomes the temporary officer for the rest of the game, for all other rule-related purposes. But despite the field promotion, the unit is stuck rolling 1 die for the rest of the game. A unit can only suffer the death of their officer once in any given game. The final character type are Spellcasters. They have the Spellcaster 1-5 ability, which gives them the ability to cast spells. Before the game begins, you pick a number of spells equal to the Spellcaster's ability number from the spell list in the back of the book. A spellcaster can pick from the list of spells specific to their race or from the general spell list. Each spell listing details what it does, how it works, and lists a casting number or CN which determines how difficult it is to cast. Unless stated otherwise, spells require line of sight to their target, last for the duration of the game, and have an unlimited range. When a spellcaster successfully activates, they may use one of the actions to cast a spell. To do so, pick the spell you wish to cast and roll a number of dice equal to the spellcaster's ability level. If any of those dice are equal to or greater than the casting number of the spell is successfully cast and takes immediate effect. If none of the dice are equal to or greater than the casting number, the spell fails and the action is wasted. A spellcaster may only attempt to cast 1 spell per activation, and they cannot attempt to cast if there is an enemy model within 2 inches. Because it requires an action to cast a spell, spellcasters are more often deployed as units of 1 rather than in units, as any other model in the unit can take no action while the spellcaster spells. Monsters are creatures ranging from dragons to barghists to wraiths that fight independently on the tabletop. Not that all big ugly brutes are monsters. Trolls and ogres are not, for example. To make it easy, monsters have the monster special ability. To make them all unique, they come with a number of other special abilities, giving them a wide variety of roles on the table. Monsters are all units of 1. They never gain any benefit from command, no morale boost and no command activation, and they always roll the champion die in combat. Artillery covers machines of war such as catapults and ballista that throw heavy objects across the table. Their units consist of the machine itself and a number of crew figures as annotated in their special abilities. The stats in the unit block are those of the crew, with the exception of the shoot stat, which is a combination of the crew's ability and that of their machine. A character may never join an artillery unit. An artillery unit may never move and shoot in the same activation, although they may maneuver and shoot. When an artillery unit takes the shoot action, it follows the normal rules, except when calculating combat dice. To do that, you look to your target and refer to the artillery modifier table. An artillery unit rolls 1 die for each rank, full or partial, in the target unit, plus 1, to the normal maximum of 5. You also get to add extra dice depending on whether the target is large, enormous, or being shot at from the flank or rear, again with the maximum total being 5. One of the dice rolled is always the champion die, and a target cannot shield against a shooting attack from artillery. When shooting at a unit of 1, the artillery unit adds 5 to the target number, unless the target is large or enormous, as hitting a single figure is more difficult than hitting a block of models. When the artillery unit is on the table, the artillery model itself is treated as the unit's officer for determining line of sight and movement. All of the crew are placed in contact with the artillery piece itself, although their exact placement isn't important. When fighting in combat, artillery units never have more than 1 rank, and when determining combat dice, only the crew contribute, not the artillery piece itself. If the crew are all killed, or the unit is broken, remove the artillery piece from the table. The final advanced rule I'd like to cover is that of strange and catastrophic events. These rules are entirely optional, though they have the potential to add a great deal of uncertainty and unpredictability to the game, so I think they're well worth including. When you and your opponent make an initiative roll, and a player rolls doubles, refer to this strange event table to find out what happens. If both players roll doubles, that'll give you 2, play them out in initiative order. Strange events vary from units being poisoned, to stumbling upon a magical item on the battlefield, to a champion rising to the occasion. Additionally, if both players roll identical doubles, giving the same result on all 4 dice, a catastrophic event occurs. These are game-changing events such as a pair of dragons crashing to the ground to do battle, or a great darkness shrouding the sun. A black omen indeed. The main rulebook has both strange and catastrophic event tables, and some of the supplements include others. If you are playing a scenario, it may dictate which to use, or you may decide with your opponent before the game begins. With that, there are a couple of things that I have skipped over. I've got to leave some mystery after all, so I'll leave you to discover those yourself, but I've covered the vast majority of the rules, and you should have a pretty good idea of how to play. A huge thank you to my patrons for their continued support. It's very, very much appreciated, and thank you all for watching. I do hope that you have found this series helpful, and I hope you get some sweet games in. Anyway, we'll see you all next time. Cheers!